Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you. Let me welcome. Let me welcome you to this opera talk, and thank you for coming. In the first instance, can you hear me? Which, of course, can you hear me? Oh, okay, good, excellent. So the opera you're about to hear is a case in point of the politics of musical reputation. And it has a very unusual history. And so you have to consider that when it was written in the early 1870s, it was premiered in 1875 in Russia. Anton Rubinstein was arguably the most famous Russian musician in the world. More famous than Tchaikovsky, particularly here in the United States. In the early 1870s, he made, if you would believe it, a 33-week tour of the United States, going to every possible city, country, city and county, and to play recitals. He actually kept, in order to make sure he wasn't underpaid, he kept a detailed record of, I think, 33 or 36 weeks of constant playing, 12 or 14 concerts a week. He was a great, great pianist and a great personality, great stage personality. And this tour was sponsored by the Steinway Piano Company, and it was extremely vital to Steinway that had made a massive conversion around the Civil War from the square piano to the grand piano as a consumer item and to dominate the concert market. So it was a kind of a traveling act where the most famous pianist in the world, arguably, was going to sell the instrument. It was a demonstration. He was the software and the piano was the hardware. And he also pioneered in recitals that not only featured his own music, but historical music, the sonatas of Beethoven and so. So he was world famous as a pianist. He was a friend of Franz Liszt, and he also had a reputation in German-speaking Europe. He was the director of the concerts of the Society of Friends of Music in Vienna, the oldest and most venerable music society on the continent, and a position that was held also by Brahms. And he had a following in Vienna. And his composition, The Tower of Babel, had been very successful. He was extremely prolific, and he was legendary as a conductor, as a composer, and as a pianist, obviously. And one of his other great achievements is an opera on the story The Maccabees, which is written with Mosenthal in German, and for a German-speaking audience. And that gives you the clue. He has also Shulamit, The Tower of Babel. Both he and his brother Nikolai Rubinstein, who was the founder of the Moscow Conservatory, were both born Jewish. They were the family converted in order to get the right to live outside of the Pale settlement. So conversion was a way of doing so. And the parents were ambitious for the children. However, Rubinstein was not, never detached himself psychologically from his origins as a Jew. The first pogroms, for example, in later 19th century Russia were a matter of deep concern for him, to him as symbolic. But he was also an incredible patriot, a Russian patriot. He believed in his own nation and was loyal to the monarchy, and which controlled all organizations, musical and otherwise. It was an autocracy, and it was he who bears the greatest credit for the flowering of Russian music, because he being patronized by a close family member of the imperial household, was the one who transmitted the proposal to build a conservatory, the first professional conservatory in Russia in St. Petersburg, which was granted by Alexander II. And shortly after the death of Nicholas I and the accession of Alexander II, who was in the 19th century the liberal czar, who emancipated the serfs and brought legal reform to Russia, he wrote a piece in the leading German language periodical on music about the future of Russia's music, and made the claim that folk music, looking for the future of Russian music in its folk music, was not the best way to go, and urging for a professionalization. All this should have made Anton Rubinstein a hero, but he was not. So he made two mortal enemies. In German-speaking Europe, it was Brahms, who lived in Vienna. And Brahms was quite a decent, liberally minded, actually not an anti-Semite, but he thought Anton Rubinstein's music was poor, of poor quality and poor craftsmanship. And he also had a personal enmity because he wanted to conduct the first performance of the Schicksalslied, the Song of Fate. These are small politics, but if you think composers have bigger personalities than the rest of us, forget it. Each of you still burns from small slights from people you barely know, whom you will never forgive, and we live in a politics in America where no one is willing to change his or her mind, no matter how enormous the evidence. So if that is human nature, Brahms wanted to conduct it himself and didn't, and then in a fit of pique he withdrew the first performance of the Triumphlied, a piece for chorus and orchestra, from Rubinstein. And Brahms represented the group of German-speaking musicians most likely to like Rubinstein, because certainly Richard Wagner was not going to like Rubinstein, despite the close relation between Rubinstein and Wagner's father-in-law, Franz Liszt. The reason was that, first of all, he was Jewish, and if Meyerbeer got hammered in the famous mid-century essay by Wagner about the Jews and in music, it was hard, and Mendelssohn as well, it was hard to imagine that Rubinstein would escape. And I'll come to the argument in a moment. So the likely allies of Anton Rubinstein would have been the more so-called conservative faction, the post-Schumann group of people who didn't like Wagner, were not appreciative of the Wagnerian aesthetic or politics, and that would have been sympathetic to Rubinstein. And he ran afoul of their leading individual, Brahms. And in fact, when he accepted his post in Vienna to run the Society of Friends of Music, he was angling for a similar post he hoped in Russia. But going to the Russian scene, Anton Rubinstein, with the exception of Tchaikovsky, who remained really loyal to Rubinstein and admired the music and admitted to its influence over him and credited him, the rest, Rimsky was better than the other four of the so-called Mighty Five, but the group that had grown up in the 1860s under the sort of pioneering advocacy of Vladimir Stasov, the chief critic of art and painting of the Russian 19th century, what we call the Mighty Five, which will be the subject of this year's festival, with its leading figure Rimsky-Korsakov, that they were virulently anti-Semitic, virulently in a racial sense. Balakirev particularly, Mussorgsky particularly, Borodin hard to know, Rimsky not, and Cui probably harmlessly so. He was less vicious than the others. And Stasov was virulently anti-Semitic, the publicist, the critic. So Despite imperial patronage, Rubinstein had a hell of a time of it in his own native land because of his status as a Jew. No amount of baptismal fluid erases racial identity. And there is, in fact, the more the Jew approximates the majority, the more hated the Jew becomes. So assimilation and acculturation are actually enrage the prejudiced. The prejudiced would love to have the people they hate in camps, in ghettos, in refugee camps. But when they join society and they do what we do and they be just like us, then our real rage explodes. And Rubinstein's, the idea that he was a representative of Russian music infuriated someone like Stasov. So Rubinstein became a man without a home, a kind of permanent artistic exile. Everywhere he went, he was something else. In America, he was Russian. You know, in Europe, he was Russian and Jewish, and in Russia, he was European and Jewish. So he was really never quite at home. And nonetheless, these people all knew each other. So, for example, the first piano run-through of The Demon was with the Mighty Five in attendance. I mean, they all knew one another. It was a small place in terms of literary, artistic community. And the thing was first, when he finished it, it was banned because the poem itself was banned. So Lermontov's poem was only published after the poet's death because it was presumed sacrilegious. It was censored. There was rampant censorship in the 19th century in Russia. Vladimir Nabokov likes to say it was terrible, but given how stupid the censors were, it wasn't that bad. But it still was censorship, and the Lermontov poem ran afoul of religious conviction, catechismic religious conviction. So what's interesting about this is I want to warn you all. The effort we do here, which is attempt to revive, not as a curiosity, but as a potential contender for a living repertoire. Not as a one-off, but in hopes that what we produce will be so successful as The Demon was with its original audiences, despite the critics, that it will be produced elsewhere and will be part of the repertoire so that the opera repertory doesn't shrivel to death by anachronistic conservatism. I think opera companies don't understand the audience. They think they want yet another La Boheme, or Lohengrin set on Mars without a swan, you know? And that the only thing they can think of is to manipulate the story and the production and hope that a new star will be born, Hollywood style, that people will rush to hear, as if the voice were the important thing and not the work. So the audience is only comfortable comparing Maria Callas to Renata Tebaldi to today's contender. I think the audience is much smarter, much more curious, and would love to hear opera that they will fall in love with and remember after the first hearing. I'm not talking about modernist opera, which I would defend, which isn't so accessible on first hearing, and the tastes of the current opera world are not consistent. There are a lot of operas done over and over and over ago that have, from some view of musical sophistication, are tiresome. There are also operas that people pack the house that lack any dramatic forward motion, that are mesmerizingly soporific. And I'm a little baffled by the enthusiasm, for example, for Wagner's Parsifal. I mean, that's a long time to sit. I mean, it's great music, I have no doubt, but don't tell me it's filled with dramatic forward motion. So our tastes are not totally objective, and they're very subjective, and they're historically irrational. Why some operas are not in the repertory and some are, and often politics intervenes. This is one case. I am a little pessimistic. I have a bad feeling about no matter how well all of us do this afternoon or did on Friday and will do on Wednesday. The music of Anton Rubinstein comes from a different world, a world where there was no recording, where a high percentage of the audience were amateurs, and where you had to catch the audience on first hearing. And what that required was a different sense of time. There's repetition here. There's repetition. And there is a simplicity and a directness which is different from the kind of intensification, neorealism of Wagnerism. It's very hard for us to appreciate operas that come from before Wagner and Verdi, from a different sense of dramatic time. It's ravishingly beautiful, which its first audiences understood, and deeply humanly effective. Effective. It's a great opera. Requires no apology, but you will not pick up a single history book in the history of music or Russian music that does not either damn it with faint praise or disparage it. They don't disparage the minor Italian bel canto works. They don't disparage the lot of mediocre stuff that stays on the board. So if anybody tells me that anti-Semitism and its history and legacy doesn't lie beneath the refusal to embrace the quality of this work, I won't buy it. Just because Bellini wasn't Jewish, or Donizetti wasn't Jewish, or Leoncavallo wasn't Jewish, doesn't make their perfectly fine, beautiful operas. I don't have to denigrate them. But is this any worse? No. I would argue it has unbelievable beauties. So you're in for a treat, in my opinion. And no apology is necessary. But you have to understand that. So there were several defenders of this opera, most famously Shaliapin, and who played the demon, and he carried it. And then in recent memory, the late Dmitry Hostovsky, and I want to speak for the entire cast. We would like to dedicate today's performance to his memory. He actually saw the virtue of the opera. It was a great vehicle for him. And he did much to revive it in Russia. Interest in the opera. And the opera was immensely influential. You'll read that it was influential on Tchaikovsky, on Onegin, particularly, but also for those of you who saw the Oresteia we did by Taneyev, wonderful opera. The final scene of the Taneyev is inspired by the closing scene of The Demon. Balakarev and Mussorgsky and others were actually slightly envious. Rubinstein made the mistake of writing a lot. He was obviously brilliant and quick, and there's an immense amount of music, and some of it is not so good. But that can be said also of other composers. And he wasn't wildly self-critical, and he didn't necessarily subscribe to the idea that music should be defined by its ability to develop musical ideas according to a standard pattern that had been developed, let's say, by Beethoven, whom greatly admired the actual Beethovenian elements here. So his most famous piece, which was written around the same time, is called the Ocean Symphony. And this was another reason why we have difficulty grasping his aesthetic. So the Ocean Symphony, when it was done in New York in the 80s and 90s, was among the most popular things you could go to. In Brooklyn, for example, it was done several times a week, and the place was packed. To understand that is to think that our greatest competitor as performing artists, as musicians, is the sound film. People went in the 19th century to an instrumental concert to have the experience of time change just by hearing. And this was a travelogue in sound, just as you'll hear storms and thunder here. Tone painting, using the color of the orchestra, the way Beethoven did in the Wellington's Victory in the period of battle symphonies. There were no moving images. So people sat mesmerized over an hour hearing the story of I don't know, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and its beauties and storms and so forth. It was so popular that Rubinstein added 3 more so he could have 7 Cs, not only 4. This was a kind of music as a kind of storytelling device, and its clarity and its the easiness of reading it was extremely important. There are tremendous beauties. Much of the music in this opera is made of romances, which are songs, and there are folk elements. So let's go to the heart of the question here, that among the things that motivated the Russian mid-19th century was to establish equality with Europe as a cultural nation through music. And the leading edge of that was the so-called Mighty Five and the development of a nationalist voice using folk material. Well, there is some Georgian folk music here in the first act. You'll hear it. And the second act is very classically Oriental. No mistaking it. And this is written almost 16 years before Scheherazade. So you're in for a treat in a kind of a bathing of real Oriental dance and coloristic effects. It's clearly Russian. There's nothing un-Russian about it. The second aspect of Russianness was the loyalty to the specific character of the Russian language. So one of the composers of the 19th century, Dazhomysky, was a particular, and so was Mussorgsky, particularly adamant about the significance and the priority of the rhythm and sounds and meaning of the Russian diction. So many of the composers went to great literary texts. So Onegin, Queen of Spades, Boris Godunov, those are all Pushkin, right? The other great poet of the 19th century, the Romantic poet, also killed in a duel, was Mikhail Lermontov. And he is the author of the poem, The Demon. Now, The Demon is, in character and story, probably most similar to The Flying Dutchman. The first line of the Lermontov poem, which doesn't appear here, is where the demon self-describes himself as an exile, which he is, out of heaven, wandering the world, in search of redemption. And the redemption is through the acquisition of human love. Now, this poem is also inspired by Byron, and whose material Rubinstein had set to music before. But it was also, the poem had been banned, and it became a legendary poem. It's probably part of every Russian's schooling is to read. If we read Shakespeare and Whitman, they read Pushkin and Lermontov, and the poem has some twists to it, which attracted Rubinstein in the early 1870s. First, the language is utterly beautiful. The first librettist, he quarreled with the first librettist when finally the thing became ready for production in 1874. Apparently there was a mix-up in the mail, and the librettist didn't get the revisions. And then what Rubinstein did himself was in the last act, the duet between Tamara and the demon is taken directly from the Lermontov poem, directly, because the end of the Lermontov poem is actually a dialogue between Tamara and the demon. So it's a response. She talks, he talks, he talks, she talks. So he explains to her his plight and so forth and so on. The twist in the story of the demon, number one, is that in his effort to conquer this Tamara, whose beauty he becomes mesmerized by, is that he kills off her fiancé. Well, that's an easy way to get the girl, kill off the rival, but there's something not totally acceptable about it as a means of courtship. That's problem number one. Problem number two is the one that's more interesting, is in the nature of love. So the issue of sexuality is thrown into the foreground. And the question is, there's a way of understanding this as the demon representing what we would now call the instinctual, right? And that the moral, the rational, and you have the classic opposition not between good and evil, but between spiritual love and erotic love. And the demon, clearly, as the devil, is the instrument of eroticism. Now, that's, from a moral point of view, an unfortunate choice, and psychologically difficult to handle. And there are those who argue that choice is essential for any kind of human decency, organization, and productivity, if you believe a kind of Freudian type of analysis. But in the late 19th century, the fascination with a rule-breaking erotic personality, a demonic figure, Napoleon, Beethoven, there's a romantic hero, the romantic Manfred, the romantic personality. This was, the poem was written, before 1848. It was in early 19th century in the height of European Romanticism, and the kind of aspiring demonic figure, which is both the object of fear and hate and also deep attraction. And that is played out here in this poem. Because in the end, Tamara gives in to him, and she's rescued, if you think that's a rescue, by death and by going to heaven. And because the demon stole her physical mortal love, her sexual desire, he did not capture her soul. In fact, presumed to inject evil into her soul. Now, there's a complicated way of thinking, and it is a particular pattern of thinking about human nature and mortality, because he is immortal. And it's an old dialogue. It's the same issue that obsesses Greek mythology. That's why Zeus comes to Earth to seduce human women, because the one thing that humans have that gods don't have is love. Because love is a necessity in order to come to grips with our own mortality. We create the capacity for love. And that's what the story is here, that the demon is with envy looking, although he is immortal and has huge power, we actually possess something they want, and that is the capacity to create affection and bonds among and between us in the form of love. That's sort of the basic argument of the poem. The production we have done is brilliantly put together by a colleague who's done, I think, 6 productions here with us, Thaddeus Strasburger, and he has done something which I think is very, very helpful to the opera, that by shifting the focus of the opera away from the demon onto Tamara. So it becomes not only the story that you see, but also a kind of mirror of an internal dialogue in Tamara herself about her life. So in a way, it is a very understandable story of a young woman who is faced with two choices: a respectable, predictable life, marry the good guy that the parents want you to marry, and then that exotic lover who is presented himself, which means rebelling against your parents, abandoning everything you've grown up with, a kind of tension between respectability and non-respectability, between safeness and irrational, erotic passion. Speaking as a parent, I much prefer the arranged marriage because I don't trust my children's passions, and I should have told my parents to do the same. But in any event, but the fact remains that this sort of using Tamara as a lens by which to tell this story of the demon is very effective, and the opera is really a tour de force, I think, in Rubinstein's output. Among the there are a couple of things. Really, nothing has stayed in the repertory. There's a piano concerto, which is about it, and some small pieces, more in Russia because of the romances for domestic music making. But this is a man who's been airbrushed out of history. This is really, so if you go back, Tchaikovsky becomes the most famous composer out of Russia, and the sort of elimination of Rubinstein from the picture after he dies, although he comes back to Russia after a sojourn in Europe to once again become head of the conservatory in 1887 in St. Petersburg. He himself admits to, he recognizes that his reputation as a composer, even as a pianist, is on the decline. Tchaikovsky, he died within several years of one another. And then in the Soviet period, there was no particular, sort of the aesthetic was sort of bourgeois art. And the Soviets had no particular investment in reviving the reputation of Rubinstein, and the Soviet policy did itself flit between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, but their pro-Jewish policy was so heavily directed at the Yiddish tradition and not toward an assimilationist pattern of life, which the Rubinsteins reflected. So he didn't benefit through the Soviet period, and so it's only in the post-Soviet space, really, that with Rostovsky, that there is some glimmer of revival. So I would say that I think you'll be delighted. This was a very successful opera and very popular opera, and from the first moment, you will. It requires no apology, but that doesn't mean we'll be successful in changing the way the opera repertoire is organized, or the way that Rubinstein's stature as a composer is dealt with. Questions? Many of you, I know several of you know a lot more about this than I do. So each year we have really aficionados coming to see the production. So, yeah.
I just saw in the director's note here, it says the production picks up a story out of order. Has the director made changes in the...
So I don't know. In American universities, there's a debate about something called a trigger warning. You ever heard about this? Yeah. So this is a debate that the right wing was accusing the left wing of babying college students by telling them, warning them that there might be something terrible that happens in the book they'd have assigned. Now, I don't know what everybody's worried about. That's what every teacher told me. Handed me a book and said, in this book, a lot of people die. There's a lot of blood and guts. And then I thought, every opera goer gets a trigger warning. It's called plot summary. There's no surprise. Why are we so angry at students? Everybody comes into the house, knows exactly what happens. Told in great detail. And so what, I mean, it's just totally gratuitous. So, but I don't know how much of a giveaway I'm supposed to do. So, since you asked the question was whether the story is actually not told differently from the opera. It's not been reorganized. However, there is a way that scenically you can see what he presents as a flashback. So imagine that she is in the convent at the very end before she dies, and she's remembering what happened. That's why you see, so there's a kind of framing of the story, but the story isn't changed. Well, this is done uncut in the order in which Rubinstein wrote it. You know what I mean? But I see, I didn't read the, I apologize. Yes. I think they're referring to the idea that it's a flash. It doesn't happen in ordinary sequence. You know what I mean? So that you see, and it's set in the convent. So there's you have an idea that you're hearing her telling of the story. The voice of the visual narration becomes hers. I think that's the idea, which I think is perfectly reasonable. But there's no scenes are reorganized. I mean, nothing is distorted in that way. Yeah.
Quick question. I am very familiar with this opera. I saw it in Russia already. The two dances just before the announcement of Cinadel's death in the second act, are you doing them?
So this man owns every recording of The Demon. And The Demon is his favorite Russian opera. So he's the audience member I'm most worried about. So he asks a question which only somebody knows the opera knows. So, as you know, dance was an integral part of 19th century operatic entertainment. And the most famous quarrel over that happens to do with Tannhäuser and its premiere in Paris and where to do the ballet, the Venusberg. And so the dancing that Wagner had was in the first act while Tannhäuser is in Venus, in the Venusberg. So mostly it's in second acts, and indeed it is here. There are two second act ballet sequences, or dance sequences, let's call them dance sequences. He asks a question because dramatically, before the announcement of the prince's death, there's a wedding, and of course the groom doesn't arrive because he's dead, which of course is the best excuse not to arrive at a wedding. But the way the composer and the librettist have decided to extend this is that as they wait for the groom to arrive, they have some more dancing. Now, there's a dramatic problem in this because the audience has already seen the dancing and they want the story to move on, right? So, but we do the second sequence. We do truncate it. That's the one cut that we do take, is we don't do the entire second sequence of dancing complete. Because I think, A, the music repeats itself over and over and over again, and therefore it was obviously written for some kind of elaborate choreography, which actually we all agreed does not make dramatic sense. You could actually leave it out, and there are productions that do leave it out. There are productions that leave out both dance sequences. We have the first sequence complete without any cut. The second is just truncated. It has a beautiful tune, and you'll hear the tune enough never to forget it, and then we move on. it does give the second act a better proportion. We tried it uncut. Actually, we were in rehearsal with it uncut. And I think, as in a musical theater piece, you have to fix it. In other words, loyal to the text, until execution is a form of unnecessary martyrdom, And if you bring enough people in who have pretty good objective eyes, and they say the sequence, the end of the act two, is you rob that experience by this extended dance, and we don't have a ballet company here. I mean, there's a limit to what, we can't even afford to do this. So the idea of having a ballet company in addition, I mean, is way above our means. So so in the absence of a serious choreography, and the music itself is probably, if I had to pinpoint the weakest moment, where Rubinstein is paying at least attention to what he needs to do, he obviously had been asked by the theater to take the second ballet and do something with it, and I think he just repeated, changed harmony, it's endless, and it finally, we're not losing musical value and we're losing dramatic value. So it is truncated, but not eliminated. Okay, so the question is whether, so for this will be the 8th production that has a professional DVD documentation, but its availability for commercial distribution is a matter of finances and a matter of agreements with unions of the varying participants and the artists. I think eventually there'll be a way found to release them, but not, I don't think, anytime soon. And so it is. I think we have scholars have looked at, for example, so if people request to be able to see them for scholarly reasons, we're happy to oblige. So they become reference materials, but not commercially available.
Does the demon, excuse me for using the article, actually exist, or is he a figment of Tamara's imagination and her inner conflict in this production?
You want to know? Yeah, it's very good. You want to know whether the demon is a real person. That's a very central question. So. Rubinstein himself thought of this as a spiritual, a fantasy, a visual fantasy. So I think he thinks that there's a prologue and epilogue in a way, and the whole thing takes place between heaven and hell, and it could be that this is an imaginary, right? But I think he hedges his bets, but there is something generic about this guy. He's a generic character, but he's a real person. And a real person in the sense that he's a character. I think it could be read as being a spiritual. You could read the whole thing, the opera, not the poem, I think, but as a kind of mental fantasy, dream, an extended dream, possible.
Could be read that way, but do you think the Russian people at the time of the opera really thought of him as a
that's whether the people at the time
kind of
thought
like
this was a real. I think they thought it was a real person. I don't think they thought it was a supernatural stand-in, if you know what I mean. No, I think it's a good question. I would guess, but I'm guessing, that the audience at the time thought of him the way they think of Mephisto in Faust. So that's a real guy, and with a real personality, and not simply a placeholder, if you will. That's my guess, and partly because opera doesn't lend itself well for metaphysical representations. Because the opera audience is opera is more even than the theater audience, is attached to the personality. So 19th century opera, when the opera star was really an important personality, let's say in Meyerbeer is a good example. In the great Meyerbeer operas, the audience had a schizophrenic relationship to the person on stage. So on one hand, the person was trying to play a role, Catherine the Great, a heroine, a hero. But they were also Mr. Famous Singer, right? So unexpectedly, especially with coloratura virtuosity, they would step out of a naturalistic role and do some pyrotechnics and bring the house down, right? So suddenly, Catherine the Great, became Nicole Kidman, and then she became back Catherine the Great. She returned. So this sort of in and out, there was Luke Skywalker, and then there was, what's his name, Mark Hamill? I don't, he became his contemporary personality and his fictional personality were somehow interchangeable, and that was the magic. So Meyerbeer, for example, was not interested. Wagner was the one who really wanted to create an illusion. He darkened the hall. He buried the orchestra. It was kind of a narcotic drug. You went to Bayreuth, and it was so long you couldn't help believe it was real. And so suddenly there was fire and smoke, and there was the Rhine, and then he had the Rhine maidens hanging from these unbelievable sadistic contraptions, singing to give the illusion that they were in the depths of the Rhine, and somehow he made it happen. He made it happen that through the musical brilliance, Wagner is a realistic novel, although it's mythic in nature. The experience of time is you forget that it's a famous singer. It's René Pape. You don't think I came to see. You did come to see René Pape, but then you forgot about it the moment he got dressed up and he was looking, even in Meistersinger. So, but the pre-Wagnerian played with the in and out of, and the same your question between. So the supernatural element seems to me hard to put across. Next year's opera, if you want to know, is Korngold's Das Wunder der Heliane. Now, this is a metaphysical opera. Now, we're now struggling with how to put that on the stage, precisely because it doesn't have the kind of clear dramatic storyline that this does have. Those are tough operas to put on the stage. Pelias, good example.
I hope that you have singers for Heliane.
You hope we have.
Kepura was singing. He was the first tenor with Jerica.
So he is pointing out that.
I saw that in Brno, and there was terrible tenor, and soprano was.
Who invited you? Yes, a terrible tenor. Yes. So, but because I know, even worse. Yes, we can forgive So the Das Wunder der Heliane, he was saying, requires great singers. But first of all, we specialize in young singers. We like to foreground younger singers. Second, as you know, as an opera, he has a T-shirt which says Operaholic. Right. So this is true. There is no easy opera to sing. No easy opera to sing. And so casting is a really, the opera is made or fails by casting. The good news is that the generation coming up of young singers that are in our own vocal arts program, but also in conservatories around the country, are terrifically talented. There's a lot of talent out there. And the trick is to trust a young talent. All of our audience doesn't come because somebody famous is singing, you follow me? So the names on tonight's program are probably unknown to all of you. First of all, the leads are all from Russia. We chose that because singing in Russian, last year when we did Dmitri, we had no native speakers. We had only, so we had a wonderful Czech coach, which helped make it possible. But in this case, because of the significance of the language as part of the operatic texture, and we thought we'd be better off with people who understood immediately what they were singing, and the relationship of words, especially in recitatives and so forth, words to music. German language is a little easier there because more singers in the United States are familiar with German, as with French and Italian being the lead languages. So I don't think we'll have trouble casting Das Wunder der Juliane. And I think it'll work in this house, which is not gigantic. And so, but it's a wonderful opera. That's Erich Wolfgang Korngold is the subject of next year's festival. And we decided to do an opera of his from the 20s. The last really dramatic opera he wrote before he switched the primary emphasis of his career to the writing of Hollywood soundtracks. And a last question, and then I'll let you rest before the beginning of the show. Yes?
Hi. So after World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, when one would like to think hearts became maybe a little more understanding, Rubinstein was still shunned. There were all the Jewish people involved in the arts, and
I didn't quite understand the beginning of the question.
well, after the war and
After
the
the Second World War.
right, Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust, I like to think that hearts became a little more understanding, and with all the Jewish people involved in the arts, late 20th century, this composer was still shunned.
Mm-hmm.
And did you meet with any resistance to doing this?
Well, I think the presumption is reasonable, but overly optimistic. So the question is that after the war, if you look at the three most prominent European Jewish composers who suffered from the anti-Semitism in their own lifetime, and then from the extreme politicized and brutal racism of the Nazi regime, and also of Stalin's anti-Semitism, which became paranoid and very dangerous in the late 40s and early 50s, around the time of the Doctor's Plot, when actually Shostakovich's friend Mieczysław Weinberg was actually arrested. And he was only actually saved by the unexpected death of Stalin in '53. So your view is that we should rethink this. So you're right, but not on Rubinstein's case. So the person who benefited most from the post-war sense of guilt is Felix Mendelssohn. So the Germans went to great lengths in the post-war period to rehabilitate the centrality of Mendelssohn in their musical life. The tragedy is that they've not been totally successful despite their best efforts, because, again, we fail to understand that Mendelssohn's project was very different from what we want. Mendelssohn's project, he was a deeply committed Protestant and a follower of Friedrich Schleiermacher's, and he believed that music was a way to inspire the belief in God. So music had to be accessible, it had to be direct, there was no taste for avant-gardism or kind of negativism. It was a kind of an affirmative enterprise, even in a late work like Elijah. And this celebration of beauty and the divine seems naive to us. We have become narcoticized by this sort of chromatic intensity and almost erotic power of the Wagnerian. So to go back to Mendelssohn, it seems tame to us. And though a lot had been done to revive it. The other victim of anti-Semitism is Meyerbeer. And we did Huguenots here. And it's a fantastic opera, especially uncut, when you actually restore the drama. But people have been waiting around for a Meyerbeer revival for generations. The most famous opera composer of the 19th century. You can't get it started. And they never heard of Rubinstein. Rubinstein, first of all, the number of people that still mistake Anton Rubinstein for Arthur Rubinstein is many. And so he was just a man in a footnote in a history book. American music historians know about him because his role in popularizing classical music in America. The history of the piano, everybody who knows him, he was a big, giant, towering virtuoso who also never practiced, and therefore his performances were littered with, memory lapses, wrong notes, and so, but people thought it was terrific. We didn't have quite the antiseptic taste we have now because of the machine-edited recording, which means the human then is required to be as perfect as the edited machine, which young people are able to do. But he was, so there's never been a serious Rubinstein revival. And the truth is that there's an awful lot of music to plow through because a lot of it is just music written for an occasion. It doesn't have any ambition to rise higher. The Demon is not in that class, and there are other works that bear. But I don't think that there are few successful aesthetic reputations that have been rescued by moral guilt. It doesn't seem to work. In fact, we remain attached to people whose moral behavior is utterly repulsive. I think of the great German composer Karl Amadeus Hartmann, who was a real hero, a non-Jewish German who risked his career and refused to collaborate with the Nazis, a great composer. And despite that he is a moral exemplar of the conscience of an artist, and his work is great, getting it on concert programs is practically impossible. And that has to stop. My last plea to you, ladies and gentlemen, is these operas for the last 13 years have been the beneficiary of the benefaction of a single family. And their grant to us comes to an end. So one of the things that you need to know is that although we have this wonderful house and we do good work, we attempt to do good work at a very high level, we're motivated by the fact that we can't afford it. We're caught in a paradox. Each of you thinks coming here that we're well funded, because why else nobody who didn't have any money would do something like this, right? Well, it's exactly the opposite. We do it because it's the right thing to do and because nobody else is doing it. And so I want to appeal to each and every one of you as we put together a fund for the next few years of these opera productions, if you care about this art form and you care about our role in bringing underrepresented opera back to the stage, please be generous. It is deeply appreciated. And I want to thank those members of the family that made it possible to this point on behalf of everyone in the college and in the cast for having enabled these events to happen. So please be our friend, not only by coming, but by support. Although we don't look like a cause that needs your help, trust me, we do. Thank you very much.